For 8 years, my daughter lived with guilt, believing she was the reason they had no children. Then one afternoon, my son-in-law walked into my house with his pregnant mistress twins on the way and dropped a stack of divorce papers on my table, certain he was about to take everything. He talked for 4 minutes. He never looked down. I set my teacup down slowly and looked him straight in the eyes. Wait, my daughter didn't tell you anything, did she? I'm incredibly grateful you're here with us. For more gripping tales of family bonds, a protective dad, and calculated revenge stick around. Which country or city are you watching from? Comment below. Please note, some fictional parts are added for educational and entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to names is coincidental, but this lesson is highly valuable. I used to believe that a quiet life was a safe one. After 40 years of working with numbers, contracts, ledgers, financial statements that told the true story of a company, when its owners couldn't bear to look, I had come to trust the ordinary. The predictable. The Tuesday afternoon that looked exactly like every Tuesday afternoon before it, right down to the low angle of the autumn light coming through my kitchen window and the smell of the coffee I'd left sitting too long on the burner. I was 63 years old. I had buried my wife, raised my daughter alone, and built something from nothing with these two hands. I had learned across all of those years that the moments that change everything rarely announce themselves. They arrive in the middle of a Tuesday. They arrive wearing the face of something small. The knock at my front door came at 4:20. I knew it was Clara before I reached the hallway. I don't know how to explain that with any precision. A father simply knows the particular rhythm of his child's knock, the way you know the sound of your own name in a crowd. But when I opened the door and saw her standing on my porch, I understood immediately that this was not a visit. Clara was 34 years old, and she had her mother's eyes steady dark, the kind of eyes that didn't cry easily. I had watched those eyes hold themselves together through 3 miscarriages, through more medical appointments than I could count, through the particular quiet grief of a woman who has been told again and again that the thing she wants most may not be possible. Clara did not break easily. She had never broken easily. She was broken now. Her hands were shaking around the strap of her bag. Her mascara had tracked 2 thin lines down both cheeks, and she hadn't wiped them away, which told me she hadn't noticed, which told me whatever had happened recently, within the last hour, maybe less. "Dad," she said, and her voice cracked straight down the middle of that single syllable, and I stepped back from the door without a word and let her in. She didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of my living room with her coat still on her bag, still on her shoulder, and she held out her phone to me with both hands, the way you'd hand someone something that had burned you. "I need you to look at this," she said. "I need somebody else to see it, so I know I'm not going crazy." I took the phone. The image loaded slowly, the way photos sometimes do on an older connection, resolving itself in pieces from the top down. I saw Julian's face first. My son-in-law of 8 years, smiling the particular smile of a man who believes he is exactly where he is supposed to be. Beside him stood a woman I did not recognize, younger than Clara by several years, dark-haired, her face turned slightly toward Julian, with an expression I had no difficulty reading, even in a photograph. His right hand rested on the curve of her stomach, unmistakably round beneath a fitted sweater. The caption underneath read, "Our babies are almost here." I stood very still. I have spent my career reading documents that contain devastating information, and I have learned that the first thing you must do when you encounter something that changes everything is absolutely nothing. You do not react. You do not allow your face to become a mirror of what you are feeling, because the moment you do, you lose the only advantage available to you, which is that no one yet knows what you know. I read the caption a second time. I looked at Julian's hand on that woman's stomach. I looked at my daughter's face, which was watching mine with the desperate attention of someone who needs confirmation that what they are seeing is real and not some failure of their own perception. "When did you get this?" I asked. My voice came out level. I was grateful for that. 20 minutes ago." Clara pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth for a moment, composing herself with visible effort. "It came from his number. He must have meant to send it to someone else. A friend, maybe, or I don't know. I don't know who he meant to send it to, but it came to me. And I opened it, and I just... I've been sitting in my car in your driveway for 15 minutes because I didn't know what else to do." I handed the phone back to her carefully. "How long have you been home?" I asked. "Before this came through. I got off a call at 3. She blinked hard twice. "I was going to start dinner. I was thinking about what to make for dinner, and then my phone lit up and I thought it was nothing." She stopped. Her chin trembled once sharply, and then she brought it back under control. 8 years, Dad," she said quietly. 8 years I spent thinking I was the problem. All those appointments, all those procedures. I used to apologize to him. I used to actually apologize like it was something I had done to him, like my body was something I owed him an explanation for. Her voice broke on the last word, and this time she couldn't pull it back. The tears came hard and sudden, her shoulders shaking forward, and I crossed the room and put my arms around my daughter and held her the way I had held her when she was 7 years old, and the world had first shown her that it did not always keep its promises. She cried for a long time. I let her. Outside, the autumn light had dropped even lower, going amber through the window the way it does in late October, turning everything it touched the color of something almost finished. I held my daughter and looked out at my yard and thought about 8 years. About what 8 years of the wrong story does to a person who believes it completely. When she finally pulled back, her face was red and wet and more honest than I had seen it in longer than I could say. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. "You came exactly where you should have," I told her. "This is where you come." She pressed her eyes shut. "What do I do?" I looked at my daughter, at the woman she had become, who was stronger than she knew, and had been carrying more than any person should carry alone, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not grief, not anger, though the anger was there, cold and particular, the kind that does not announce itself with noise. Something else. Something that had been waiting perhaps for exactly this moment. Right now. I said, "You're going to take off your coat. You're going to sit down in that chair by the window, and I'm going to make you a cup of tea." She looked at me with those eyes, her mother's eyes full of tears she'd already spent, and tears she was still holding back, and she did exactly what I said. I went to put the kettle on. And while the water heated, I stood at my kitchen counter, and I made myself a promise, quiet and absolute, the way I made all the promises that mattered. Whatever he had taken from her, I was going to get back. My father never raised his voice in his life. But when he was truly angry, the room went very still. I understood that about him from the time I was old enough to understand anything. My grandfather had been the same way, a man who had grown up with nothing in rural Kentucky, who had built a hardware business from a single storefront and a handshake reputation, and who had never once needed to shout to make himself heard. There was something in the Sterling men, some particular quality of stillness that other people seemed to register in their bones before they registered it anywhere else. I thought about my grandfather that Tuesday evening as I carried 2 cups of tea into the living room and set one down in front of my daughter. Clara had taken off her coat. She was sitting in the chair by the window, the one her mother used to sit in, the one I had never been able to bring myself to replace, with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance that had nothing to do with my living room. She was somewhere else entirely. 8 years back, maybe. Or further. I sat down across from her and waited. She started talking slowly, the way people do when they've been carrying something so long that they've forgotten how to set it down without being careful about it. She told me about the IVF cycles, 4 of them over 3 years, each one more grueling than the last. The hormone injections that left bruises along her stomach, that she hid under loose blouses because she didn't want Julian to feel guilty. She told me about the 3 pregnancies they had lost, each one early, each one its own private catastrophe, that she had processed mostly alone because Julian, she said, always seemed to move through grief faster than she did. I used to think that meant he was stronger than me, she said, turning her cup in her hands. I thought I was the one who couldn't cope. He'd be sad for a week, maybe 2, and then he'd come home one night and say something like, "We're going to be okay, Clara. We're going to figure this out." And I'd think, what's wrong with me that I'm still not okay? She pressed her lips together hard. Nothing was wrong with you, I said. I know that now. Her voice dropped. I think I'm just starting to know that now. I drank my tea and let her continue. She told me about the last appointment, 6 weeks before the one where Julian had sat across from a specialist and held her hand and told her with great tenderness and apparent conviction that they should consider one more round of treatment, that he wasn't ready to give up, that he believed in her. She had driven home from that appointment feeling grateful, feeling loved. That was the word she used, and the way she said it quietly, almost to herself, like she was already ashamed of it, made something tighten in my chest with a particular focused fury. He was very good at that, I said. Clara looked up at me. What? Making you feel like his faith in you was a gift he was choosing to give. I kept my voice even. That's not love, sweetheart. That's a performance. She stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. Not agreement exactly, but the beginning of it. The first crack in a story she had been telling herself for a very long time. It was then that I remembered the dinner. 6 months earlier, Julian had arranged what he called a business dinner at a restaurant downtown, a place too expensive for the occasion and too loud for actual conversation, which I had suspected at the time was not accidental. He had invited 2 of his professional contacts, men I did not know well, and he had spent the better part of the evening talking about expansion plans and market positioning and a restructuring of the company's equity structure that he described as routine. At one point, one of his associates had turned to me and asked what I thought of the proposed changes. Before I could answer, Julian had laughed an easy, dismissive laugh, the kind designed to sound affectionate, and said, "Arthur's more of a big-picture guy. He leaves the details to the people who enjoy that kind of thing." The table had moved on. Clara had not noticed, or if she had chosen not to show it. But I had seen the way Julian looked at me in the moment after he said it, just a flicker, barely a second, quick enough that no one else would catch it. It was not the look of a man who had spoken carelessly. It was the look of a man who had said precisely what he meant and wanted to know if it had landed. I had filed that look away, the way I filed everything, without comment, without reaction, in the place where I kept the things that required patience rather than an immediate response. Sitting across from my daughter, now watching her turn her teacup in her hands and try to reassemble 8 years of her life into something she could make sense of, I retrieved that file. I understood something in that moment that I had only suspected at the dinner table 6 months ago. Julian had not married my daughter despite my involvement in the company. He had positioned himself carefully over years precisely because of it. "Clara," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." She looked up. "In the last year, has Julian mentioned anything about the company, about ownership or restructuring, or changes to how things are documented?" She frowned. He mentioned something a few months ago, something about streamlining the equity paperwork. He said it was just administrative. She paused. Why, did he ask you to sign anything? No. She shook her head slowly. He said he'd handle it. He said it wasn't worth my time. I nodded once and looked down at my tea. I wasn't worth his time. That was what he had said 6 months ago at a dinner table in front of men he was trying to impress. He had looked at me afterward to see if I had understood. He had mistaken my stillness for ignorance. That was his first error. It would not be his last. I want you to do something for me, I told Clara. I want you to go home tonight, and I want you to behave exactly as you normally would. Don't confront him. Don't let him know you've seen the photograph. Can you do that? Her jaw tightened. For how long? Not long, I said. Just long enough. She held my gaze for a moment, and I could see what it cost her, the idea of walking back into that house and sitting across a dinner table from the man who had sent that photograph, and pretending that the world was still what it had been that morning. It was not a small thing I was asking. Okay, she said finally. Okay, Dad. She left a little after 9. I walked her to her car and watched her pull out of the driveway, and then I stood on my porch for a moment in the cold October air before I went back inside. I did not go to bed. I went to my study instead, sat down at my desk, and opened the bottom drawer where I kept the contact information I rarely needed. I found the number I was looking for on the 3rd page of a leather-bound notebook I had maintained for 30 years. An attorney named David Calloway, the best in the city for what I needed, a man I had met once at a conference years ago and had hoped never to require professionally. I picked up the phone. It rang twice before he answered, his voice alert despite the hour. David, I said. It's Arthur Sterling. I'm sorry to call late. I need to meet with you tomorrow morning first thing. I have a situation that requires someone who knows how to move quietly. A pause on the line. Then, how early can you be here? 6:30, I said. I'll have coffee ready. I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of my study, the desk lamp throwing a small circle of light across the surface of 30 years of careful work. On the corner of the desk, in a silver frame I had polished just last week, was a photograph of Clara at 17, standing in front of the car I had helped her buy with her first paycheck from her summer job, grinning so wide her eyes had nearly disappeared. She had been so proud of herself that day. So completely uncomplicated proud. I was going to give her that back. I reached for the lamp and turned it off. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark for an hour, maybe 2, staring at the ceiling, the way I had not done since the weeks after Margaret died, that particular kind of wakefulness that has nothing to do with insomnia and everything to do with a mind that refuses to stop working, because it knows somewhere beneath the level of conscious thought that there is something it needs to understand before it can rest. I got up at 2 in the morning, made myself a second cup of coffee I didn't need, and sat down at the kitchen table. I want you to understand what 8 years of believing a lie feels like. Not from the inside, Clara has lived that, and it is not my story to tell in full. But from the outside. From the particular vantage point of a father who watched it happen and missed it entirely, which is its own kind of weight that I have not yet found the words to put down properly. Clara was 30 years old when she married Julian Mercer. She had known him for 2 years, long enough, she told me, to be certain. I had my reservations, not about his character, which I had not yet had reason to question, but about a quality I had noticed in him early and could not precisely name, a kind of fluency with other people's expectations. Julian always seemed to know what a room wanted from him, and he provided it so naturally that you found yourself grateful before you had stopped to ask whether the performance was the same as the thing itself. But Clara loved him. And Clara was not a woman who loved carelessly. The trouble started 14 months into the marriage, though neither of them knew it was trouble yet. Clara called me on a Sunday afternoon in a voice I recognized from her childhood, the voice she used when she was trying to sound more composed than she felt, and told me that they had been trying for a baby and that it wasn't happening the way they had expected. "We're going to see a doctor," she said. "It's probably nothing." It was not nothing. What followed were 3 years of appointments that Clara described to me in pieces over phone calls and occasional dinners, never the full picture, at once always with that careful composure that I had raised her to maintain in public, and that she had mistakenly decided included me. Fertility specialists, hormone panels, procedures whose names I had to look up afterward to understand. She told me about the injections, daily, timed precisely the kind that leave marks on the body that take days to fade. She mentioned them once, almost in passing, and when I asked about them at our next dinner, she changed the subject, which told me they were worse than she had let on. I should have pushed harder. I know that now. The first miscarriage happened on a Wednesday in March, 2.5 years into their marriage. Clara called me from the hospital not crying, which frightened me more than tears would have. She said it in the same voice she had used at her mother's funeral, the one that was holding itself together through sheer force of will and would not accept any assistance. "It happens," she said. "The doctor says it happens more than people talk about. We're going to be okay." Julian took a week off work. He brought her flowers, called her family, made dinner every night for 10 days. When I came to visit, he met me at the door with the right expression on his face, grief, but contained the grief of a man who was being strong for his wife, and I shook his hand and thought he is handling this well. I was reading a performance and calling it character. That is the mistake I will not forgive myself for most easily. The second miscarriage came 8 months later. This time, Clara did not call me from the hospital. She waited until she was home, until Julian had gone back to work, and then she called me on a Thursday afternoon and talked about it the way you talk about something that happened to someone else. Distant, organized, wrong. "Clara," I said, "how are you actually doing?" A pause. Long enough that I heard her breath change. "I keep thinking it's something I'm doing," she said. "Or not doing. The doctor says there's no evidence of that, but I keep thinking, what if it's something I could fix if I just figured out what it was?" I told her it was not her fault. I told her the same thing a dozen times over the months that followed in different words from different angles, and she received each version of it with the same polite acknowledgement that meant she had heard the words but could not quite make herself believe them. Because the story she was living did not support what I was telling her. Here is what the story told her. She was the one who had the appointments. She was the one who took the medications and tracked the cycles and adjusted her diet and her sleep and her stress levels according to a schedule that had taken over the calendar of her life. She was the one whose body was being monitored, measured, and found wanting month after month, year after year. Julian was there. Julian was supportive. Julian was sad when she was sad, and strong when she needed him to be strong. Julian was not the one being tested. That I understand now was the architecture of the lie, not a dramatic deception, not a single moment of deliberate cruelty, but something far more insidious, a slow arrangement of circumstances that pointed all the blame in one direction, while the truth sat quietly somewhere else, sealed in an envelope that the wrong person had opened and the right people had never been allowed to see. I did not know about the envelope then. I would not know for another 2 weeks. What I did know, sitting at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning with my second cup of coffee going cold, was this: for 8 years my daughter had been apologizing. To Julian, to doctors, to herself. She had been running the kind of internal accounting that a person does when they have accepted responsibility for a problem that has not yet been solved, cataloging her own failures, looking for the variable she had missed, assuming the answer was in something she had done or not done rather than in something she had never been told. I had watched it happen. I had watched Julian sit beside her at the dinner table and speak about their situation with the measured sadness of a devoted husband, and I had thought, he loves her. He is trying. This is hard for both of them. I had not once in 8 years considered that his recovery might be faster than hers, for a reason that had nothing to do with emotional resilience. The third miscarriage happened 19 months before the Tuesday Clara appeared at my door. She had called me afterward in that same composed, distant voice, and this time I had driven to her house without asking permission. I had let myself in with the key she had given me years ago, and found her sitting at her kitchen table in the dark, still in the clothes she had worn to the hospital, a cup of tea in front of her that had long since gone cold. I had sat down across from her and not said anything for a long time because there was nothing to say, and because sometimes the most honest thing a father can do is simply refuse to leave. Julian had come home 2 hours later. He had walked in, seen me sitting there, and rearranged his face in the span of a single second, the practiced ease of a man shifting between versions of himself so quickly that you might not notice the transition if you weren't specifically watching for it. I was watching for it. I had not known what I was seeing then. I filed it. The way I filed everything. In the place where I kept the things that required patience. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I closed my eyes and thought about what Clara had said at dinner 3 months after the third miscarriage. Julian had been particularly attentive that night, refilling her water glass without being asked, asking about her work with the kind of focused interest that looked like love if you weren't examining the timing of it. At one point, she had looked across the table at him with an expression I recognized the careful gratitude of someone who has decided after considerable internal negotiation to trust the person in front of them. She had trusted him completely. And somewhere across the city, in a house I had never visited, a woman named Elena was carrying his children, and Julian Mercer had been dividing himself in half for long enough that the division had become its own kind of fluency. I opened my eyes. I picked up the pen on the table in front of me and wrote one line on the notepad I kept by the coffee maker. What did he need from this marriage that he couldn't get anywhere else? I underlined it twice and looked at it for a long moment. Then I wrote the answer. The company. I have spent 40 years in business, and the one thing those 40 years taught me above contracts, above market timing, above every strategy I ever learned or developed or stole from someone smarter than me, is that the most dangerous person in any room is not the one who wants to take something from you. It is the one who has already decided how. I understood that by 4 in the morning, sitting at my kitchen table with the word company written in my own handwriting on a notepad in front of me. The anger that had been building in my chest since Clara appeared at my door had settled into something colder and more useful. The particular clarity that comes when a man stops grieving what has happened and starts calculating what to do about it. Julian Mercer had not married my daughter on impulse. He had married her on a timeline. I could see it now, the way you can see the architecture of a building once you step far enough back from it. He had spent the first 3 years of the marriage establishing himself, learning the company's structure, building relationships with the staff, making himself indispensable in ways that were easy to mistake for dedication. He had asked intelligent questions at the right moments. He had been present at meetings where his presence was not strictly necessary. He had gradually, and without announcement, made himself a fixture in a business that my father had built, and that I had spent 30 years growing into something worth protecting. I had let him. Because he was Clara's husband. Because he seemed to care. Because I am, despite everything, a man who extends trust before he has been given a reason not to, and I have paid for that quality more than once in my life. 3 weeks before the photograph arrived on Clara's phone, Julian had made his move. I did not know this yet on the morning after Clara's visit. I would piece it together over the days that followed from documents and testimony, and one conversation with a man named Ray Dobson that I will get to in time. But I want to tell it to you now in the order I eventually came to understand it, because the shape of what Julian did matters as much as the fact of it. Ray Dobson had worked for Sterling Logistics for 11 years. He was 51 years old, a careful, quietly competent man who had joined us as a junior account manager and had risen to head of operations through the kind of steady, unglamorous reliability that keeps a company running without anyone noticing it is being kept. I had always liked Ray. He was the sort of man who arrived early and left late and never asked for recognition, which meant he almost never received it, which was a failure of mine that I have thought about more than once since all of this came to light. Julian had noticed Ray approximately 18 months before the photograph. What Julian had noticed specifically was that Ray carried a personal debt, a loan taken out 6 years earlier, to cover his wife's medical treatment, the kind of debt that is just manageable enough that a careful person can keep it invisible to everyone around them. Julian had found this out through means I still do not fully understand and have chosen not to pursue because some knowledge is more useful as motivation than as detail. He had approached Ray quietly over the course of several months, with the particular patience of a man who knows he is playing a long game. Not with threats, not at first, with attention, with the careful friendliness of someone who wants you to feel seen before they ask you for something. Julian had a gift for that. I had noticed it years ago without understanding what it was a gift for. By the time Julian made his actual request, Ray had been softened without knowing he was being softened. The request was this: Ray was to sign his name as a witness on a series of documents relating to the transfer of equity within Sterling Logistics. The documents had been prepared by an attorney Julian had retained privately. Not David Calloway, not anyone connected to the company's existing legal relationships, but someone hired specifically for this purpose, which told me everything I needed to know about how clearly Julian had thought this through. The documents, if filed, would transfer a controlling interest in the company into a holding structure that Julian controlled. My signature appeared on them, my full name in what I will say was a competent forgery, good enough to pass a casual inspection, and probably good enough to pass a less than careful legal review. Under United States law, what Julian had done constituted forgery, the fraudulent signing of another person's name on a legal document with the intent to deceive, as well as fraud by wire and potentially securities fraud, given that the documents involved the transfer of business equity. These are federal offenses in addition to state crimes, which meant that if the evidence was sufficient, Julian's exposure was not limited to a single jurisdiction. Ray had signed as a witness. He had also quietly, and without telling anyone, made copies of everything, every page of every document, every communication Julian had sent him, in writing every record of the transactions as they had been structured. He had stored these copies in a place Julian did not know about, in a folder on a personal drive he kept at home because Ray Dobson was a careful man, and careful men make provisions for the possibility that the thing they have been pressured into doing may one day require explaining. I did not know about Ray's copies yet. I would find out soon enough. What I knew at 4 a.m. was only what I had worked out from the shape of things, from Julian's questions at meetings, from his interest in the equity structure, from the casual comment he had made 6 months ago about administrative paperwork that Clara had repeated to me without knowing what it meant. I wrote Ray Dobson's name on the notepad beneath the word company. I did not know yet that Ray had kept copies. I did not know yet what Julian had done or precisely how he had done it. But I had spent 40 years reading the way a business moves, and I could feel the outline of something wrong, the way you feel a splinter before you can see it, a faint, persistent wrongness in a place where everything should have been smooth. I added one more line beneath Ray's name. He was so convincing. That was always his greatest skill. Julian Mercer had spent 3 years making himself indispensable to my company, and 8 years making my daughter believe she was the reason their family had not grown. He had sat beside her in hospital waiting rooms and held her hand through 3 devastating losses, and looked me in the eye across dinner tables and performed with extraordinary consistency the role of a man who had nothing to hide. 3 weeks ago, he had finished the paperwork. He had gone home that night and sat across the dinner table from my daughter and suggested with great tenderness that she consider one more round of IVF treatment. He had reached across the table and covered her hand with his and told her he believed in her. He had looked at her with the expression of a devoted husband and said the words that a devoted husband would say. And then he had gone to bed and waited for the documents to be filed. What he had not accounted for was a father who did not sleep. I tore the top sheet off the notepad, folded it once, and put it in my shirt pocket. Then I went to get dressed for my 6:30 meeting with David Calloway. David Calloway's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown that had been there since before I started Sterling Logistics, back when this part of the city was still the kind of place where a man could afford to take up space without apologizing for it. The reception area was empty at 6:30 in the morning. No assistant, no other clients, just the low hum of the heating system and a pot of coffee on a small table by the window that was, as promised, already made. David met me at the door himself. He was 61, 2 years younger than me, with the kind of face that had settled into permanent composure sometime in his late 40s and had not moved much since. We had met at a business conference 15 years ago, had stayed in loose professional contact ever since, and had never had occasion to work together because the situation that required David Calloway was specifically the situation you hoped would never arise. He poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of me. "Talk," he said. I talked. I told him about the photograph, about Clara, about the 8 years I had watched my daughter carry a weight that I now believed had never belonged to her. I told him about the dinner 6 months ago, about Julian's comment about the look that had followed it. I told him about the equity restructuring Julian had mentioned to Clara as something administrative not worth her time. David listened the way good attorneys listen, without expression, without interruption, with a quality of attention so complete it felt almost physical. When I finished, he set down his cup and looked at me for a moment. "You think he forged your signature?" he said. It was not a question. "I think he had it forged," I said. "Julian is many things. Careful is one of them. He would not have done it himself." David nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to move quietly," I said. "I need you to help me understand exactly what has been filed, what can be reversed, and what can be used. And I need Clara kept out of it for as long as possible. She is going home today and behaving as though nothing has happened, and I will not have that put at risk by anything that moves too fast." David picked up a legal pad and wrote 3 words at the top of the first page. "I'll need access to the company's corporate records," he said. "Articles of incorporation, the current equity structure, any amendments filed in the last 2 years. Can you get those to me by end of day?" "I can get them to you by 10 o'clock, I said. He almost smiled. "Then we have something to work with." I left his office at 7:45 and drove directly to Sterling Logistics. My father spent 40 years reading numbers the way other men read faces. He used to say that a financial statement was a portrait that if you looked at it long enough, you could see not just what a company was doing, but what it was thinking, what it was afraid of, and what it was trying to hide. I had inherited that from him, the way you inherit a particular way of holding your shoulders, or a preference for strong coffee not through instruction, but through years of watching someone do something so naturally that it becomes part of how you understand the world. I arrived at the office before any of the staff and let myself in with my key. The corporate records were kept in a fireproof cabinet in my office, a practice I had maintained since the early days of the company, when the only security system we had was a deadbolt and my own paranoia. I unlocked the cabinet, pulled the relevant files, and spread them across my desk in the order I needed. I started with the equity structure, the current ownership breakdown of Sterling Logistics, which had been formally documented and filed with the state 3 years after I founded the company and updated periodically since. My name, my percentage. Clara's name listed as secondary beneficiary following an amendment I had made 8 years ago, the week before her wedding, as a gift I had not told her about because I had not wanted it to feel like a transaction. I worked through the amendments chronologically, the way I always worked, oldest to newest, building the picture before I tried to read it. The first 15 years were clean. The next 10 were clean. The last 2 years required more careful attention. I found it on the 4th page of a document filed 14 months ago. It was a single amendment to the equity allocation. Technical language, the kind that is designed to be uninteresting, the kind that relies on a reader's eyes sliding past it, because nothing in the surrounding context suggests it requires scrutiny. It described a restructuring of the company's ownership into a holding structure with a new entity listed as co-holder of a 31% interest. The entity's name meant nothing to me. My signature appeared at the bottom of the page. I looked at it for a long time. I looked at the way the letters connected, the angle of the capitals, the particular pressure of the pen on the final flourish of the G in Sterling that I had developed sometime in my 30s and had never been able to train myself out of. The flourish was wrong. It was close. Someone had studied my signature carefully enough to reproduce the general shape of it, the proportions, the lean of the letters. But the flourish on the jihad was wrong, too deliberate, too even the mark of someone who had practiced the movement, rather than arrived at it naturally over decades of signing their own name. I had signed my name on every document this company ever produced. I knew what my signature looked like. This was not it. My phone buzzed on the desk beside me. A text from Clara. Told him this morning. Said maybe we should try again. He seemed happy. He made breakfast. I'm okay, Dad. Don't worry about me. I read it twice. I typed back, good girl. I'll call you tonight. I set the phone face down on the desk and looked back at the document in front of me. Ray Dobson's name appeared as witness on the signature line below mine. His handwriting I recognized. Ray had a cramped, leftward-leaning script that showed up on every document he had ever signed for the company. It was unmistakably his. But his signature was also wrong in a different way than mine was wrong. Mine had been forged by someone trying to replicate it. Ray's looked like his own, but it had the particular quality of a signature signed under duress. I had seen that quality before in documents produced during business disputes, in contracts signed by people who had been pressured into positions they did not want to be in. There is a tightness to it, a compression, as though the hand knows what it is doing and is ashamed. I photographed every page with my phone and sent them to David Calloway with a single message. Found the first one. There will be more. Then I opened the next file. I worked through the morning without stopping, without eating, without looking up from the desk, except once when my assistant Sandra knocked on the office door at 9:15 and asked if I needed anything. Close the door on your way out, Sandra, I said, and hold my calls until I tell you otherwise. She looked at the papers spread across every surface of my desk, and to her credit, she did not ask a single question. Sandra had worked for me for 19 years. She understood, as good assistants always do, the difference between a man who is busy and a man who has found something. By 11 o'clock, I had found 3 more. I called Ray Dobson into my office at 2 o'clock that afternoon. I had spent the morning working through the remaining files, photographing everything, sending pages to David Calloway in batches with brief notes attached. By the time I set down the last document, I had found 4 separate amendments, 4 distinct attempts to shift equity out of my hands and into the holding structure Julian had created, each one built on the last. Each one was slightly more aggressive than the one before it, the way a person tests the temperature of water before committing to the plunge. The forgeries were consistent, which told me they had all been produced by the same hand, under the same direction, with the same careful attention, to making them look like something I would not examine too closely. Julian had understood one thing correctly about me. I trusted the people around me. What he had failed to understand was that trust in my experience is not the same as inattention. I did not tell Sandra why I needed Ray. I simply asked her to let him know I wanted to see him when he had a moment, which in practice meant immediately, because 19 years of working together had taught Sandra that when I said, "when he has a moment before noon," I meant now. Ray appeared in my doorway 7 minutes later. He was a compact man. Ray, medium height, broad through the shoulders, in the way of someone who had done physical work earlier in life and carried the memory of it in his frame even now. He had a face that defaulted to calm, the kind of face that is useful in operations management, because it does not alarm people unnecessarily. But when he stepped into my office and saw the documents spread across my desk, that calm fractured so completely and so quickly that I understood everything I needed to understand before he said a single word. His face went the color of old chalk. "Close the door," I said. He closed it. He did not move toward the chair across from my desk. He stood just inside the door, with his hands at his sides, and looked at the papers on my desk, the way a man looks at something he has been dreading for a long time, and has finally, with a complicated mixture of relief and terror, arrived at. "Ray," I said, "sit down." He sat. He folded his hands on his knees and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on a grown man's face in a long time, the expression of someone who has been carrying a secret so long that the prospect of setting it down has become almost indistinguishable from the prospect of being crushed by it. "I know what's on those documents," he said. His voice was steady, which surprised me. "I know what my signature is doing there, and I know that whatever you're about to say to me, I probably deserve." I looked at him for a moment without speaking. "Tell me how it started," I said. He told me. It had begun as Ray described it, with a conversation in the parking garage 18 months ago, Julian catching him on the way to his car late on a Thursday evening with the casual ease of a man who had been waiting for precisely that moment without appearing to wait at all. Julian had asked about his wife, about how she was doing, about whether the treatment had been successful. Ray's wife, Carol, had been diagnosed with an aggressive autoimmune condition 4 years earlier. The treatment had been partially successful and entirely expensive, a debt of $63,000 that Ray had managed by restructuring twice and cutting everything in his personal life that could be cut, and that had remained as of 18 months ago at $41,000 still outstanding. Julian had known the number. He just said it. Ray told me, his voice tightening around the memory. 41,000. Like he was reading it off a piece of paper. And then he said that kind of debt must be stressful, and that he hoped things were going okay, and then he said he might have something that could help. Ray pressed his lips together. I should have walked away right then. I knew what it was. I knew what he was doing. But Carol had just had a bad week and I was tired and I let him keep talking. The approach had taken 3 months. Julian had never been explicit, never said sign this or else never made a direct threat. He had simply made it clear through a series of conversations that he was in a position to help Ray with his financial situation, and that in return he needed Ray's assistance with some administrative paperwork that was, as Julian described it, entirely routine. He said it was just a restructuring, Ray said. He said you had approved it verbally, but that you were traveling and the timeline was tight. He said your signature on the documents was just a formality, that everything had already been agreed. And you believed him, I said. Ray looked down at his hands. I wanted to believe him, he said. There's a difference. I know there's a difference. I've known it since the minute I signed the first one. He looked up at me then, and there was something in his expression, not quite shame, not quite relief, but something that occupied the difficult space between them. The expression of a man who has been waiting for the moment of reckoning long enough that the moment itself is almost welcome. Mr. Sterling, he said, I kept copies of everything. The room went very quiet. Every document, he continued. Every page he gave me, every communication he sent me in writing, every record of the transactions as he structured them. I kept them on a personal drive at home. I never told him. I never told anyone. He paused. I told myself it was just in case I needed to explain myself someday. In case something went wrong and I needed to show someone what had actually happened. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. A printed list of file names and locations, handwritten notations beside each one. I can have everything on your desk within the hour, he said. Everything, whatever you need. I looked at the list. Then I looked at Ray Dobson, at this quiet, careful man who had made a bad decision under pressure and had spent 18 months living inside the consequences of it, who had kept copies not out of strategy, but out of the particular instinct of a person who knows at some level they cannot quite articulate that the truth will eventually need a witness. I was not going to tell him it was all right. It was not all right. What he had done had given Julian Mercer 14 months of cover and had put my company at genuine legal risk, and that was not something I could minimize or wave away with a generous gesture. But I had been in business long enough to know the difference between a man who does wrong because he is wrong and a man who does wrong because he is tired and afraid. And someone patient and calculating has found the precise place where he is most vulnerable. Ray Dobson was the second kind. Get me everything, I said. Today. And Ray, he looked up, you'll need to speak with my attorney. His name is David Calloway. You'll tell him exactly what you told me in exactly the same detail. Can you do that? Ray nodded. His hands, I noticed, had stopped shaking. Yes, he said. I can do that. I picked up my phone and called David. We have everything we need for the first charge, I said when he answered. And we have a witness. A pause on the line. How soon can he come in? David asked. I looked at Ray across the desk. This afternoon, I said. He'll bring the documentation with him. I hung up and stood, and Ray stood too, and for a moment we simply looked at each other across 30 years of working in the same building, not with warmth exactly, because warmth was not what the moment called for, but with the particular understanding of two men who have arrived by very different roads at the same necessary place. Go get your files, Ray, I said. He went. My father used to say that the most powerful thing a person can do is make their enemy feel safe. He said it once when I was 19 years old and working my first summer in his hardware store after a supplier had tried to underprice us out of a contract, and my father had simply smiled, shaken the man's hand, and thanked him for his time. I had watched that supplier walk out of the store looking satisfied, and I had turned to my father and asked him what he was doing. Waiting, my father had said. A man who thinks he's already won stops paying attention. That's when you move. I thought about that a great deal in the days after Ray Dobson left my office with his list of file names and his particular expression of a man who has finally, at considerable cost, done the right thing. I thought about it mostly because of Clara. She called me every evening during those days, never long calls, never detailed, because she understood without my telling her that the phone was not the place for the conversation we were actually having. She would tell me about her day in the careful, surface-level way of someone who knows they are being listened to by more than one audience. She mentioned Julian's moods, his schedule, the small domestic details that told me between the lines that he had no idea anything had changed. "He made dinner again tonight," she said on the third evening. "He's been doing that. Cooking. Being attentive." A pause. "It's worse somehow than if he were being cold." "I know," I said. "You're doing well." "Am I?" Her voice was level, but I could hear what was underneath it, the particular exhaustion of a woman who is performing normalcy while carrying something that has no normal in it. "You're doing exactly what needs to be done," I told her. "That's not nothing, Clara. That takes more strength than most people have." She was quiet for a moment. "Dad," she said, "I found something today." What she had found, she explained carefully and quietly, was an irregularity in their joint checking account, the account they had maintained together for household expenses, mortgage payments, the practical financial infrastructure of a shared life. She had been going through the statements on her laptop while Julian was in the garage, not looking for anything specific. She told me, "Just looking the way you look when you know something is wrong and your hands need something to do." She had found a recurring transfer, $400 withdrawn on the 14th of each month for the past 11 months, to an account number she did not recognize. The description listed on the statement read, "Consulting services," which was the kind of description that is designed to be boring enough that no one reads it twice. Clara had read it 11 times. "I took a picture of the statement," she told me. "Every page going back 14 months. I did it while he was still in the garage. I sent them to your email." I pulled up my email while she was still on the phone and looked at the images she had sent, clear, well lit, every digit legible. $4,300 over 11 months, moving in steady monthly increments to an account that had no obvious connection to any expense I could identify in the context of their household. It was not a large amount of money in the scheme of what Julian was attempting, but it was a thread. And threads, in my experience, have a way of unraveling things far larger than themselves when you find the right end to pull. "You did well," I said. "I'm sending these to David tonight." "There's something else," Clara said. Her voice had shifted lower, more careful, with the particular quality of someone describing a scene they are still trying to make sense of. "When I was taking the pictures, Julian came back inside. He didn't see me looking at the statements. I'd already closed the laptop. But he came and stood in the kitchen doorway and just watched me for a second." "What did you do?" I asked. "I looked up and smiled," she said. "I told him I was just checking the weather." I was quiet for a moment. "And he believed you," I said. "I think so." Another pause. "He made me a cup of coffee after that. Decaf, because he knows I don't sleep well when I have caffeine at night. He remembered that." Her voice caught very slightly on the last sentence. "He still does those things, Dad. He still remembers." I don't know what to do with that. I understood what she was telling me. She was not asking me whether to forgive Julian. She had moved past that question, and she knew it. She was telling me something more complicated, that the person who had betrayed her was also in some compartment of his life, a person who had paid attention to her. that those two things existed simultaneously, that knowing the second one did not undo the first, but that it made the first one harder to carry in a way that was difficult to explain to someone who had not lived inside it. "You don't have to do anything with it," I told her. "You just have to keep going for a little while longer." She exhaled slowly. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She told me one more thing before we hung up. She told me that she had lain awake the night before, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she had shared with Julian for 8 years, and that for the first time in all of those 8 years, the feeling that had kept her awake was not grief, and it was not guilt, and it was not the quiet, corrosive self-blame that had been her companion through every failed cycle and every loss, and every morning she had woken up and decided to try again. "I was angry," she said. "For the first time I was just angry, not at myself, at him." I let that sit for a moment before I answered. "Good," I said. After we hung up, I sat in my study and looked at the bank statements she had sent me. $400 a month moving quietly and predictably for 11 months to an account that Julian had apparently believed I would never look at. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong. I was beginning to understand about a great many things, but most profoundly about this, he had looked at my daughter and seen a woman who was too tired, too beaten down by 8 years of loss and self-blame to look back. He had not considered that I would look. He had not considered that she would look first. I forwarded the bank statements to David Calloway with a note, thread to pull. Check the account on the receiving end. Then I closed my laptop, poured the last of the evening's coffee, and sat in the quiet of my house thinking about my daughter lying awake in her own bedroom, finally after 8 years angry at the right person. I had never been more proud of her in my life. Julian thought he had been careful. He hadn't been careful enough. I understood that completely by the morning of the 13th day, when I spread the full case across the floor of my study, every document, every photograph, every page Ray Dobson had delivered in a manila envelope the afternoon he left my office, and looked at it the way my father had taught me to look at a financial statement. Not piece by piece, all at once. The whole portrait before you try to read any single feature of it. It covered the floor from the desk to the window. 4 forged amendments to the equity structure of Sterling Logistics, each one filed with the state through a third-party registered agent that Julian had retained specifically to create distance between himself and the paperwork. 11 months of $400 transfers from the joint account. David's investigator had traced the receiving account to a shell entity incorporated in Delaware, a state whose business registration laws are deliberately designed to make ownership opaque, which told me Julian had received advice from someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Ray Dobson's complete testimony, typed and notarized, detailing every conversation, every pressure point, every document Julian had handed him, with the casual confidence of a man who has already decided the other person has no choice. 3 separate communications from Julian to Ray, sent through a personal email account rather than the company system. Another error of confidence, the kind that people make when they have been careful for so long that they begin to believe their caution is the same as their invisibility. David Calloway had built something thorough and devastating from all of it. He had filed the civil lawsuit the previous afternoon, a complaint against Julian Mercer alleging fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty, accompanied by an emergency motion for an asset freeze order. In the American legal system, a civil asset freeze can be granted by a judge when a plaintiff demonstrates 2 things. First, that there is a substantial likelihood of success on the merits of the fraud claim, and second, that without the freeze, the defendant is likely to dissipate or conceal the assets before judgment can be reached. David had demonstrated both methodically and without excess in 43 pages of filing that I had read twice the previous evening and found both times to be exactly what the situation required. The judge had signed the order that morning. Julian Mercer's personal accounts, his business accounts, and the accounts of the shell entity in Delaware were now frozen, meaning no withdrawals, no transfers, no movement of any kind without court approval. Any attempt to access those funds would constitute contempt of court, a separate legal exposure on top of everything else he was already facing. On the criminal side, David had worked in parallel with the district attorney's office, to whom Ray's testimony and the forged documents had been provided 3 days earlier. The arrest warrant had been issued the previous afternoon, approximately 2 hours after the civil filing, a timing David had coordinated deliberately so that Julian would have no opportunity to learn about the civil action and use that knowledge to prepare for what was coming on the criminal side. Julian Mercer did not yet know that either thing had happened. He would find out on Thursday. I stood at the window of my study and looked out at the yard, the oak tree my wife Margaret had planted the year Clara was born, now 34 years old, and broader than I could wrap my arms around. Margaret had chosen that spot specifically, she told me, because she wanted Clara to be able to see it from her bedroom window when she was old enough to look out. Clara had looked out at that tree for 18 years. I thought about Margaret then, about what she would have said standing in this room looking at the floor covered in documents that told the story of what had been done to our daughter. Margaret had been a quieter person than I am, more patient, more willing to extend the benefit of the doubt past the point where I would have withdrawn it. She had always been better than me at finding the redeemable part of a difficult situation. I wondered what she would have found redeemable in this one. I was still standing at the window when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. A number I did not recognize, not a contact, not a saved number, not a pattern I associated with anyone in David's office or the district attorney's. A local area code, nothing more. I answered it on the third ring. "Mr. Sterling." The voice on the other end was a woman's older, careful, with the particular quality of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say many times and is now in the moment of saying it, discovering that the rehearsal was not sufficient preparation for the reality. "This is Beatrice. Beatrice Mercer." I said nothing. I waited. "I know who you are," she continued, her voice tightening around something that sounded underneath the composure very much like fear. "I know what you've been doing. I overheard Julian on the phone 2 weeks ago. He didn't know I was in the house. I heard enough to understand what he was planning." A breath. "And I think I believe you have every right to do it. Julian has done things that—" She stopped. "Then what are you calling for Mrs. Mercer?" I asked. A pause on the line, long enough that I could hear her breathing slow and deliberate, the breathing of someone trying to keep themselves together through sheer force of will. "There is something you need to know," she said finally, her voice dropping to something close to a whisper. "Something about my son. Something that changes the meaning of what Clara has been through. All of it. Every year of it." I moved away from the window and sat down in the chair behind my desk. "What does it change?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "I can't tell you over the phone," she said. "Please, not like this." Her voice cracked very slightly on the last word, just a hairline fracture, quickly controlled, but there. "You deserve to hear it properly. And I have needed to say it to someone for a very long time." I looked at the documents covering my floor. The asset freeze, the arrest warrant, the 43 pages of David Calloway's careful, devastating work. I had believed, looking at all of it 20 minutes ago, that I understood the complete shape of what had happened to my daughter. Sitting now with a phone pressed to my ear, listening to a woman I had never met, try to hold herself together long enough to tell me something she had apparently been carrying alone for longer than I could yet calculate. I felt the ground shift beneath what I thought I understood. "Where can we meet?" I asked. She named a coffee shop, small, she said, not far from where she lived, a place she went on weekday mornings when it was quiet. She said it in the particular way of someone describing familiar ground, a place that felt safe enough for something unsafe. "Tomorrow morning," I said. 8 o'clock. "Yes," she said. 8 o'clock. And then very quietly, before she hung up, "Mr. Sterling, please don't say anything to him yet. Don't tell Julian I called." I set the phone down on the desk and looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked up at the photograph of Clara on the corner of my desk, the one from her wedding day in the silver frame I had polished just last week. She was laughing in it, her head thrown back, entirely unguarded, the way she used to laugh, before 8 years of quiet grief had taught her to be careful with her joy. I had spent 2 weeks building a case against a man I already knew was guilty. I was not prepared, I realized, for what might come next. I had spent 2 weeks building a case against a man I already knew was guilty. I was not prepared for what came next. Or that sentence stayed with me through the night, not as a thought I returned to deliberately, but as something that simply would not leave the way a sound stays in a room after the thing that made it has gone quiet. I lay in the dark of my bedroom with my eyes open and the phone on the nightstand and the particular stillness of a house that has been lived in alone for a long time, and I turned the question over and over, the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking for the thing on the other side, something that changes the meaning of what Clara has been through. All of it. Every year of it. I got up at 1 in the morning. There was no point pretending otherwise. I went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and stood at the counter while the water heated. Outside the window, the street was empty. The particular emptiness of a neighborhood. At 1 in the morning in late October, leaves down porch lights off the whole world, apparently asleep except for one 63-year-old man in a kitchen who could not stop thinking about a phone call he had received 3 hours ago from a woman he had never met. I poured the tea and carried it to the study. The documents were still on the floor where I had left them. I had not been able to bring myself to put them away, not because I needed to look at them again, but because there was something about the physical fact of them spread across the floor, in their terrible completeness, that felt important to preserve until I understood whether they were the whole story or only part of it. I sat down in my chair and looked at them. The asset freeze was in place. The arrest warrant had been issued. Ray Dobson had given his testimony and his documentation and had driven home to his wife Carol with the particular expression of a man who has set down something very heavy and is not yet sure his hands know what to do without the weight of it. David Calloway had 43 pages of careful, devastating argument filed with the court and was prepared to move on Thursday. Everything was in order. And yet, I picked up the legal pad from the corner of my desk, the same one I had written company on 2 weeks ago in the kitchen, at 4 in the morning, when this had all been nothing more than a shape I could feel but not yet see. Most of the pages were filled now with notes and dates and account numbers, and the particular shorthand I had developed over 40 years of working with documents that told the truth about things people preferred to keep hidden. I flipped to a clean page. At the top I wrote, "What does Beatrice Mercer know?" I sat with that question for a long time. She had known about the case, she had said so directly. "I know what you've been doing." That meant she had either been watching, or someone had told her, or Julian himself had mentioned it in a moment of confidence he had since regretted. The third possibility seemed least likely. Julian was not the kind of man who admitted to vulnerability even to his mother. Especially to his mother, perhaps. She had not called to stop me. That mattered. A mother calling to protect her son would have led differently, with a defense of his character, with an appeal to consideration, with some version of, "You don't know him the way I do." Beatrice Mercer had led with none of that. She had led with, "I know you have every right to do what you're doing," which was not the sentence of a woman who believed her son was innocent. It was the sentence of a woman who had been waiting for someone to do exactly this for a very long time. I wrote, "She is not calling to protect him. She is calling to confess something." I underlined it. What could a mother confess that would change the meaning of 8 years of Clara's life? I turned that over carefully, the way I turned a set of financial statements when I suspected something was embedded in them that was not meant to be found. The answer had to connect to Clara directly. Beatrice had been explicit about that. Not to Julian's crimes, which I already understood. Not to the affair, which was beyond anyone's ability to change. Something that touched the 8 years themselves. Something that had been present from near the beginning and had shaped everything that followed. I thought about Clara at the hospital, her voice on the phone composed past the point of composure. I thought about the 3 losses and the procedures and the years of medication and the quiet, grinding self-blame that had become so habitual she had stopped noticing she was doing it. I thought about Julian recovering faster than Clara every time, moving through grief with a speed that I had once attributed to emotional resilience and now understood, in the context of everything else I knew about him, as something colder and more calculated. What if his recovery had not been calculation? What if it had been knowledge? I wrote that down too. Then I looked at it for a long time, without being sure I was ready for the answer. At 5 a.m, I called Clara. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had not been sleeping either. "Dad." Her voice was quiet, careful, the voice she used when Julian was somewhere nearby. "Can you talk, Mug?" I asked. "He's asleep," she said. "I've been up since 3. "I know the feeling," I said. "I need to ask you something. When you were going through treatment, the early stages before the first procedure, did Julian have his own testing done, separately from yours?" A pause. I could hear her thinking. "Yes," she said slowly. "Early on. They test both partners. The doctor explained it as routine. Standard protocol." Another pause. "Why? Do you remember what his results showed?" Silence on the line, longer this time, waited. "They said everything was fine," she said, "on his end. They said the difficulty was most likely on my side." Her voice had gone very careful. "That's what they told us. That's what we understood." "Who delivered those results?" I asked. "Was it the doctor directly or—" "It was a summary," Clara said. "A printout. Julian brought it home from an appointment he went to alone because I had a work conflict that afternoon. He showed it to me that evening." A long breath. "Dad, what are you asking me?" I looked at the legal pad in front of me, at the question I had written at the top of the page and the answer I had been circling for 4 hours without landing on directly. "I'm asking," I said carefully, "whether it's possible that the summary Julian brought home that evening was the only version of those results you ever saw." The silence that followed was the longest of the night. "I need you to get some sleep," I told her. "A few hours, if you can. I'm meeting someone at 8 o'clock this morning, and I'll call you as soon as I'm done." "Who are you meeting?" she asked. I hesitated for only a moment. "Someone who I think has been waiting a long time to tell the truth," I said. "Go rest, sweetheart. I'll call you by 10. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my study until the sky outside the window began very gradually to go from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before dawn in late October. Then I went to get dressed. Whatever Beatrice Mercer was carrying, she had been carrying it alone for long enough. It was time for someone else to help her set it down. She was already there when I arrived. I saw her through this window before I pushed open the door, a woman in her late 60s, sitting at the corner table with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had clearly gone cold. Her eyes fixed on the surface of the table in front of her, with the particular stillness of someone who has been sitting in one place long enough that the sitting itself has become a kind of endurance. She looked like a woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had finally, after years of telling herself she was strong enough to keep carrying it, arrived at the place where she was not. The coffee shop was quiet at 8 on a weekday morning. 2 young men working on laptops near the window. A woman in scrubs waiting for something at the counter, the low sound of the espresso machine doing its work. The kind of place that existed in every American city, unremarkable by design, chosen precisely because unremarkable was what this conversation required. I ordered a coffee I did not particularly want and carried it to her table. She looked up when I pulled out the chair across from her, and I saw immediately that she had not slept either. Her eyes were red at the corners, not from recent crying, but from the accumulated sleeplessness of what looked like several days. She was well dressed in the careful way of a woman of her generation, for whom appearance was a form of discipline, but the discipline was fraying at the edges. Her hands, still wrapped around the cold cup, were trembling slightly. "Mr. Sterling," she said. "Thank you for coming." "Mrs. Mercer," I said. I sat down. I did not tell her it was fine because it was not fine, and she knew it was not fine, and beginning with a pleasantry would have been an insult to both of us. She looked at me for a long moment, studying my face the way people do when they are trying to determine how much truth a person can absorb before it breaks something in them. I held her gaze and waited because I had learned across 63 years that the truth comes faster to people who do not appear to need protecting from it. 8 years ago, she began, her voice low and deliberate. Julian and Clara were in the early stages of their fertility treatment. You know this. I know this, I said. What you don't know, she continued, is that at the beginning of that process, both partners were tested separately. Standard procedure, as I understand it. Julian went to an appointment alone. Clara had a conflict that day. She paused, her fingers tightening around the cup. The results were mailed to their home address. But Julian was traveling that week. I was staying at the house watching things, collecting the mail. She stopped again. I opened the envelope without thinking. It was addressed to Julian, but I opened it the way you open mail that looks routine without stopping to consider whether you should. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small piece of paper folded many times, worn soft at the creases from years of being handled. She did not unfold it. She held it against the table with 2 fingers as though it might escape if she released it. The results were not routine, she said. I kept my voice level. What did they show? Her eyes filled very suddenly with tears she did not allow to fall, the particular controlled anguish of a woman who has cried about this so many times in private that she has run out of the kind of tears that fall in public. They showed that the difficulty Julian and Clara were experiencing was not coming from Clara's side, she said. There was a significant male factor finding. The doctor had written a recommendation, a letter attached to the results, suggesting that both of them be counseled together about what this meant for their options going forward. The espresso machine behind the counter made a long, low sound. Outside the window, a car moved slowly through the nearly empty street. You didn't show it to him, I said. It was not a question. She shook her head. A single slow movement like something that cost her. I told myself I was protecting him, she said. Her voice had dropped to something close to a whisper. Julian had worked so hard. He had built himself into someone from very little, and I knew I believed that a finding like this would destroy something in him that couldn't be rebuilt. His confidence, his sense of himself. She pressed her lips together. I convinced myself that if he never knew, it would never have to hurt him. She finally looked up at me directly, and what I saw in her face was not the expression of a woman asking for forgiveness. It was the expression of a woman who understood with complete clarity that forgiveness was not the point. I called the doctor, she continued. Her name is Patricia Howe. She had been Julian's physician for several years. She knew our family. I asked her as a mother to allow me to handle the results in my own time, my own way. I told her I would speak to Julian myself. A breath. She agreed. Against her professional judgment, I think, but she agreed. And I never spoke to him. I put the results in an envelope, and I put the envelope in the back of a drawer, and I told myself I would find the right moment. She set the folded piece of paper down on the table between us. There was never a right moment, she said. And then the years went by, and I watched Clara come to that marriage appointment, after appointment, procedure after procedure, and I watched her carry the blame for something that was never hers to carry. And every year I told myself I would find the courage, and every year I did not. Her voice broke on the last word cleanly, like something that had been held under tension for too long. I was protecting myself. I know that now. I was protecting myself from watching my son fall apart, and I let your daughter pay for it for 8 years. I looked at the piece of paper on the table between us. Patricia Howe, I said. Is she still practicing? Beatrice Mercer nodded. Same clinic, she said. She never moved. I picked up the folded paper and put it in my jacket pocket. I need her name in writing, I said. And I need you to be willing to say what you've just told me to my attorney. She nodded again immediately without hesitation, as though she had been waiting for precisely this request, and was relieved finally to be asked something she could actually do. Yes, she said. Whatever you need, whatever helps Clara. I stood and buttoned my jacket. Her name, Beatrice said quietly before I turned to go. Dr. Patricia Howe. She said it the way you say something you have been keeping locked in your chest for 8 years and are only now finally releasing into the world. She kept the original file. I believe she kept it because she never stopped feeling like she owed it to Clara. I looked at her for the moment, at this woman who had made a catastrophic choice out of a recognizable love and had spent 8 years living in the wreckage of it. Thank you for calling me, I said. It was the truest thing I could offer her. She received it with both hands. I had been to this building before. That was the thing that stayed with me as I pulled into the parking lot of the Howe Fertility Clinic on the morning of the 17th, 3 days after my conversation point with Beatrice Mercer, 3 days I had spent confirming through David that the clinic was still operating under Dr. Howe's license, and that she had not in the years since relocated or retired. I had wanted to be certain before I walked through that door. The low brick building with the dark green awning, the row of juniper bushes along the front walk that someone trimmed too aggressively every spring. I had parked in the far corner 4 times, once for each of Clara's procedures. I had sat in this parking lot for hours at a stretch, drinking bad coffee from a thermos. Margaret had bought me for Christmas one year, waiting for the door of that building to open and my daughter to walk back out. She always walked out the same way, shoulders back, chin level, the posture of a woman who had decided somewhere on the other side of that door to hold herself together for the length of the parking lot. I got out of the car. Dr. Patricia Howe met me in her office rather than the reception area. She was in her early 60s, silver-haired, standing, when I entered the way people stand when they expect a conversation that will require them to hold their ground. She did not offer her hand. Neither did I. I know why you're here, she said. Then you know what I need, I said. She had made a decision 8 years ago, she told me, one she had not had a peaceful night's sleep over since. She had agreed to something she knew was wrong, told herself it was compassion, and had spent 8 years understanding that it was not. I set the state medical board folder on the corner of her desk without opening it. She looked at it. She crossed to her desk, opened the bottom drawer, and lifted out a sealed manila envelope, thick original edges worn from years of being moved and returned to its hiding place. "I kept it," she said, "because I never stopped feeling like I owed it to her." I opened the envelope there at her desk. Julian Mercer's name at the top of the first page, a date from 8 years earlier. Medical language I translated the way I had always translated difficult documents, looking for the story the numbers were actually telling. The finding was significant, unambiguous, natural conception unlikely. Both partners should be counseled together. Both partners. Clara had never been told. She had spent 8 years in the waiting rooms of this clinic, believing the answer to why was somewhere inside her own body, because no one had ever told her to look somewhere else. I looked up from the file. 8 years, I said. She blamed herself for 8 years. Dr. Howe did not look away. "Yes," she said. "She did." I closed the envelope and put it under my arm. I walked out through the pale blue waiting room, the color Clara had once told me in the dry way she had when something hurt too much for directness never worked, and out into the cold morning air. I walked to my car, put the envelope on the passenger seat, sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. Then I started the engine and drove home. I drove home in complete silence, not the silence of a man who has nothing to think about, but the opposite. The silence of a man who has too much and has learned across 63 years that the only way to carry a great deal of weight without dropping it is to stop moving everything around and simply let it settle. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call David. I did not reach for the phone on the seat beside the envelope. Though I was aware of both objects the entire drive, the phone with its list of things still to be done, the envelope with its 8 years of truth that should have been told at the beginning of all of this instead of the end. I had spent my career making sure numbers told the truth. I had built a company on the principle that the accurate account of a thing was always more valuable than the comfortable one, even when the accurate account was hard to look at. I had held that principle through difficult audits, through partnerships that went sideways, through the particular loneliness of being the person in a room who insists on accuracy when everyone else would prefer approximation. I had never imagined I would one day need to apply that principle to my own daughter's life. The drive took 40 minutes. I used all of them. By the time I pulled into my driveway, something had settled in my chest, not peace exactly, but the particular steadiness that comes after a long time of not knowing, and then finally irrevocably knowing. The shape of what had happened to Clara over 8 years was now fully visible to me. Every piece of it. The forged documents and the shell accounts, and Ray Dobson's testimony, and the asset freeze and the arrest warrant, and underneath all of that, older and quieter, and in some ways more devastating than any of it, a sealed envelope that a mother had opened by mistake, and a doctor had agreed to keep, and a daughter had never been shown. I went inside and called Beatrice Mercer. She answered on the first ring, which told me she had been waiting. "I have it," I said. "The original file. Everything Dr. Howe kept." A long breath on the other end of the line. The sound of a woman releasing something she had been holding for so long that the release itself had become a physical thing. "Is it?" she started. "Is it what I remember? Is it clear?" "It's clear," I said. "There's no ambiguity in it. There never was." Another silence. Longer. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," she said. Her voice was very quiet. I know I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it's 8 years too late. But I need you to know that there has not been a single day in all of that time when I didn't understand what I had done. I thought about Clara at 17 standing in front of her first car, grinning so wide her eyes had disappeared. I thought about Clara at the hospital, voice composed past the point of composure, saying, "It happens, the doctor says it happens." I thought about Clara last week, lying awake in the bedroom she shared with Julian Mercer, feeling for the first time in 8 years something other than grief directed at herself. "I know," I said. And then, because it was true and because she needed to hear it, "What you did this week took courage, Beatrice. It doesn't erase what came before it, but it matters." I heard her breath catch. She did not speak again for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally, "for thank you." I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the envelope on the counter where I had set it when I came in. Then I picked it up, carried it to the dining room table, and began to lay everything out. I worked methodically, the way I had always worked, oldest to newest, left to right, each document in its proper sequence, so that the table told the story in the order the story had actually happened. The forged equity amendments, Ray Dobson's notarized testimony, the shell entity registration from Delaware, David's civil filing, the asset freeze order, the arrest warrant documentation. And at the end of the row, separate from the legal documents, the manila envelope from Dr. Howe's bottom drawer. I stood back and looked at it all. I had spent 40 years building things, a company, a reputation, a life that was held together by the same principles I had inherited from my father and his father before him. I had lost Margaret and rebuilt around the loss. I had raised Clara alone and watched her become someone I admired. I had made mistakes and corrected them and made different mistakes and learned from those too. And I had arrived at 63 believing that the most important thing a man could do was leave the world slightly more honest than he found it. Looking at that table, I thought, this is what that looks like. Not heroic, not dramatic. Just a dining room table in an ordinary house covered in paper telling the truth about what had been done and what was going to be done about it. The front door opened at 6:30. Clara came in the way she always came into my house, calling out, before she was fully through the door, the habit of a child who had grown up announcing herself in rooms where she knew she was wanted. "Dad, in here," I said. She came into the dining room and stopped. She stood in the doorway and looked at the table at the full length of it, covered from end to end, in the documents that represented 3 weeks of work and 8 years of history. Her eyes moved across it slowly, the way you read something you already know is going to change you and want to take in all at once before any single part of it becomes too real to look at directly. Then she looked at the manila envelope at the end of the row. "What is that?" she asked. Her voice was very careful. "Sit down first," I said. She pulled out the chair beside me, not across from me, but beside me the way she used to sit when she was doing homework at this table and wanted company without conversation. She sat down and I sat beside her, and for a moment we were both simply quiet, looking at the table together. "The legal case is complete," I told her. "Everything David needs is filed. The asset freeze is in place, Julian's accounts are locked, and the arrest warrant has been ready since Tuesday. He doesn't know any of it yet." I paused. "He called his attorney today. He's coming Thursday. He thinks he's coming to deliver divorce papers and collect what he believes is already his." Clara's jaw tightened. "He doesn't know." "He has no idea," I said. She looked at the envelope again. "And that," I slid it toward her slowly. "That," I said, "is something I need to tell you about before you open it. Something that is going to be hard to hear, and that I want you to hear from me, not from a piece of paper." She looked at me. Her mother's eyes dark, steady, the kind that did not cry easily, but that when they did meant something had reached all the way through. "Tell me," she said. So I told her. I told her about Beatrice's phone call, about the coffee shop, about the envelope that had been opened by mistake 8 years ago and had never found its way to the person it was meant for. I told her about Dr. Howe and the bottom drawer and the file that had been kept for 8 years because a doctor had never stopped feeling she owed it to a patient she had failed. I told her what the file said. Clara did not speak while I talked. She sat very still beside me, both hands flat on the table, and she listened the way she had always listened when something mattered completely, without interruption, with the particular quality of attention that meant she was hearing not just the words, but everything underneath them. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then she reached out and put her hand over mine on the table, not dramatically, not with the force of someone overcome, but with the simple, deliberate weight of a person who needs to hold on to something solid while the world rearranges itself around them. We sat like that for a long time. Neither of us needed to say anything. Some things are bigger than words, and this was one of them. 8 years of a story that had been told wrong, finally being told right in a dining room in late October, with the full account of it spread across the table in front of us. My phone buzzed on the table beside the envelope. A message from David Calloway. He just called his attorney. He's coming Thursday. Confirmed. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down and looked at my daughter. "Is it time?" Clara asked. I looked back at the table, at the documents, at the envelope, at 30 years of a company my father had trusted me to protect, and that I had protected, and at the end of the row, the truth that should have been my daughter's from the beginning. "Almost," I said. My father used to say that the man who arrives first controls the room. I was up at 5. Not from anxiety, not from excitement. From the particular readiness of a body that has been pointed in one direction long enough that it knows without being told when the moment has arrived. I put on the kettle, filled a full pot, not a cup, and carried it to the dining room table. The documents were still there where Clara and I had left them the night before. All of it in order. All of it visible. I had decided somewhere after midnight to leave it exactly as it was. Let it be the first thing Julian Mercer saw when he walked through the door of a room he believed he had already won. I poured a cup and sat down. At 6:45, David Calloway called. "Everything is in position," he said. "The warrant is active. 2 officers assigned. They'll be in the area by 10, available on request. They'll move when the time is right." "Understood," I said. "Arthur." A pause. "How are you doing?" I looked at the table. At 40 years of my company's history and 8 years of my daughter's life laid out across the wood surface of a table my wife had picked out at an estate sale 30 years ago because she said it looked like a table that could hold a family. "I'm ready," I said. Clara arrived at 8:30. She let herself in with the key I had given her at 16, the one she had never once returned. She came into the dining room wearing the gray blazer she put on when she needed to feel like herself, sat down beside me, and I poured her a cup without asking. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "No," I said. "I don't think I am." She nodded. "I'm not either." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. "Ready," she said. We waited. At 11:47, I heard tires on the driveway. I did not stand up. I picked up my cup, took a slow sip, and set it down. "Go ahead and open it, sweetheart," I said. Clara stood, smoothed the front of her blazer, and walked to the front door. Before I reveal the exact moment Arthur completely dismantled Julian's life, I want to make sure you're ready for what's coming. If you are locked in and waiting for justice, comment "Still here" right now down below so I know who is riding with us until the bitter end. And please note, the next chapter contains some fictionalized elements crafted for dramatic effect and may not be entirely factual. If this type of content isn't for you, feel free to turn off the video right here. He walked in like a man who owned the room. He always did. That had been the first thing I noticed about Julian Mercer the night Clara brought him home for dinner 11 years ago. The way he entered a space as though he had already decided it belonged to him and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up to that understanding. It had read at the time as confidence. I had admired it in the uncritical way you admire a quality in someone your daughter loves, before you have examined what the quality is actually built on. I understood now what it was built on. He came through the front door ahead of Clara, ahead not beside the small dominance of a man who moves through entrances first without thinking about it, and he was smiling. Not the careful smile of someone who understood the gravity of what he was about to do, but the easy, expansive smile of a man who believed he had already won and was now simply here for the formality of collecting. Elena followed him in. She was younger than I had expected from the photograph, mid-30s, dark-haired, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach. The stomach was unmistakably rounded, in the particular way of a woman carrying more than one the same curve I had seen in the photograph Julian had sent by mistake, the one with the caption that had ended 8 years of my daughter's marriage in the space of a single second. She had the look of someone who had steeled herself for a difficult afternoon and was managing it through sheer composure. Her eyes moved to me immediately when she entered, then to the table, then quickly away. Julian had not looked at the table yet. He set his briefcase down by the door, with the proprietary ease of a man who has decided this house is already a transitional space, something to be passed through on the way to an arrangement that suited him better. He straightened his jacket and looked across the room at me with an expression I recognized from the dinner 6 months ago. Appraisal poorly disguised as pleasantry. "Arthur," he said. He did not call me Mr. Sterling. He had stopped doing that 3 years into the marriage, and I had let it pass because Clara had seemed pleased by the informality, and I had not yet understood what the informality was for. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder. Thick-tabbed, the kind of document assembly that announces itself as something prepared by people who are paid to be thorough. He crossed to the dining room table and set it down in front of me with a deliberateness that was designed to feel like finality. "I think this covers everything," he said. His voice carried the particular warmth of a man who wants to appear reasonable while doing something unreasonable. "I've had my attorneys keep it straightforward. Clara gets the house. I think that's more than fair, given the circumstances." He did not specify which circumstances. He did not need to. The implication was that the circumstances were the failure of the marriage, and the failure of the marriage was as it had always been in the story he was living, Clara's. He began to talk. He talked about the equity structure of the company, using terminology he had learned from watching me for 8 years and deploying it now with the confidence of someone who believes borrowed knowledge is the same as earned knowledge. He talked about transition periods and fair market valuations, and the importance of avoiding protracted litigation, by which he meant the importance of me accepting what was on that paper before I had time to think carefully about what was not on it. He talked for 4 minutes. I counted. I did not look at his folder. I held my cup of tea with both hands, and I looked at Julian Mercer, at the face I had shaken hands with at a rehearsal dinner 9 years ago, and called son-in-law for 8 years, and watched sit beside my daughter in hospital waiting rooms, while he was building with the other half of himself the architecture of everything on this table. I looked at him, and I did not touch his folder, and eventually, gradually, the way a man realizes something is wrong with a room before he can identify what it is, he stopped talking. The smile had not left his face entirely, but it had changed, thinned at the edges, become uncertain in the way of an expression that has been held too long without the reinforcement of the expected response. He looked at me. I looked back at him. "You might want to look at what's already on the table," I said. Julian looked down for the first time. Elena saw it before he did. I noticed that. I noticed it because I was watching the room the way I always watched rooms, not the center of it, but the edges, the places where the truth tends to show up first, before the people at the center have had time to arrange their faces around it. She had moved slightly to Julian's left when he set the folder down close enough to see the table clearly, and when her eyes found the top document, the civil filing David Calloway's name at the header, the words "Asset Freeze." In the first paragraph, her hand went to her stomach. Not the protective instinct of a pregnant woman. Something else. Something that understood. The color left her face the way it leaves a room when someone turns off the lights. Julian picked up the top page. I watched him read. He was a fast reader. I had noticed that across 8 years of watching him move through documents at family dinners and company meetings, and his eyes moved across the first paragraph quickly. Then they slowed. Then they moved back to the beginning and started again the way eyes do when the words are clear, but the meaning requires a second pass because the mind is not yet willing to accept what the words are saying. He set the page down. He picked up the next one, the arrest warrant. His name at the top, the charges listed below it, in the flat, unadorned language of legal documentation that does not soften what it is saying, because softening is not its purpose. He read it through to the end. Then he looked up at me. The smile was gone. Entirely, finally, without remainder. What was left in its place was something I had not seen on Julian Mercer's face in 11 years of knowing him, the expression of a man who has arrived at a destination he was certain he would never reach, and is now standing in it without a single prepared word. I looked back at him steadily, both hands around my cup. "My daughter didn't tell you anything, did she?" I said. The room held its breath. She didn't need to. I stood up. It was the first time I had risen from that chair since Julian walked through the door, and the movement itself, unhurried, deliberate, the movement of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment, seemed to change the pressure in the room. I picked up the manila envelope from the end of the table, the one that had spent 8 years in the bottom drawer of a doctor's office because the woman who kept it there had never stopped believing it belonged to my daughter. I set it in front of Julian. He looked at it. He did not touch it. "Open it," I said. He opened it. I watched his face as he read the way I had watched it across 11 years of dinners and meetings and waiting rooms, always looking for the thing underneath the thing, the expression beneath the performance. There was no performance left now. What I saw was a man reading the truth about himself for the first time in a room full of people who had already known it longer than he had. He put the pages down. He looked at Elena. Elena was already looking at him, had been looking at him since he started reading, with the expression of a woman doing rapid, terrible arithmetic. Her hand is on her stomach, on the 2 children, growing inside her, the ones he had called his own from the moment he found out she was pregnant, the ones he had built an entirely new life around. The medical report on the table said clearly that natural conception had been unlikely 8 years ago, and that nothing in the years since had changed that. Elena's hand pressed flat against her stomach. Her face had gone very still. The arithmetic was not complicated. It was simply unbearable. Clara, who had not said a word since she opened the front door, took 1 step forward. "You came here thinking you were taking something from us," she said. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. "You didn't know we'd already taken everything back." Julian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. A knock at the front door. I looked at my watch. "Right on time," I said. Clara opened it. Two officers stepped inside, warrant in hand, and the room rearranged itself around their presence the way rooms do when authority enters everything suddenly smaller, more specific, more real than it had been a moment before. The officer read the charges in the flat, practiced voice of someone who has done this many times and understands that the words themselves are the action. Julian stood through it without moving. I do not know what I expected from him in that moment, protest negotiation, some final deployment of the fluency that had served him for so long. There was none of that. He stood very still and let the words land, and then he put his hands behind his back. Elena was already at the door. She did not say anything to Julian. She did not look at me or at Clara. She pressed one hand against the doorframe as she passed through it, steadying herself, and then she was gone out into the Thursday afternoon, into a life that was going to require a great deal of reckoning that had nothing to do with anyone in this room. I did not watch her go. I watched Julian instead. He was being guided toward the door when he passed the spot where I was standing close enough that I could have reached out and touched his arm. I did not. I stood where I had been standing, hands at my sides, and I looked at the wall beyond him, the way I had looked out the window at that dinner 6 months ago, when he had smiled at his own joke at my expense and waited to see if I had understood. He passed me without a word. The door closed. The room went quiet in the particular way of a space that has just released something it has been holding under pressure for a very long time. I turned to my daughter. She was standing in the middle of the room with her arms at her sides and her chin level and her eyes bright, not with tears exactly, but with the particular brightness of someone who has been carrying something for so long that the moment of setting it down is almost indistinguishable from the moment of being able to breathe again. I crossed the room and put my hand on her shoulder. "It's over, sweetheart," I said. She covered my hand with hers and held on. "A year is long enough to understand what you've lost. It's also long enough to understand what you've kept." Julian was convicted on 4 counts of forgery and 2 counts of fraud federal charges, given the interstate nature of the shell entity. He was sentenced in the spring. Ray Dobson cooperated fully with the prosecution and received a suspended sentence and probation, which I believed was right. Dr. Patricia Howe resigned from her practice voluntarily before the licensing board completed its review. Beatrice Mercer did not come to the sentencing. I heard she had moved to be closer to her sister in another state. I did not reach out, and she did not reach out to me, and I thought that was probably the correct distance for 2 people who had been connected by something neither of them would ever entirely stop carrying. Clara used part of the civil settlement, the portion recovered from Julian's frozen accounts, after the court awarded damages to establish a small foundation. It provided legal and medical advocacy for women navigating fertility treatment who had been denied full access to their own diagnostic information. She named it simply. No story attached. Just the work. I went to see her on a Tuesday morning in late October one year. To the week from the afternoon, she had appeared at my door with her phone in both hands and her mascara on her cheeks. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a building downtown, a small room with a window that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that made everything inside it look like it was just beginning. She was at her desk when I came in, reading something, her pen moving in the margin, the way it had moved since she was 12 years old, doing homework at my dining room table. I had brought tea. 2 cups, one for each of us, in the thermos Margaret had given me years ago. I set 1 cup on the corner of her desk without saying anything. She looked up. I looked at her, at my daughter 1 year out, in a room full of morning light, with work in front of her that mattered, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, not satisfaction, something quieter than both of those. Something that had no name I could find, but that felt when I stood in the doorway holding a thermos and looking at my daughter alive in her own life like exactly what I had been working toward, without knowing it had a shape. I turned and walked back down the hall. Behind me, I heard her set the cup down. Then I heard her voice, not calling after me, just speaking quietly to the room, or to herself, or to no one in particular, the way people speak when they are finally, after a long time, saying something true. "For 8 years, I carried something that was never mine," she said. "I won't spend another day doing that, and neither should you." The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. I was smiling. If this family drama revenge taught me anything, it is this: silence is not patience. I mistook the two for 8 years, while my daughter carried something that was never hers to carry. I am not a man who speaks easily about faith, but I believe God places certain burdens in a father's hands not to punish him, but to show him what he is still capable of. I was 63 years old when I understood what I was truly built for. In every family, stories revenge. Someone has to decide the truth matters more than the comfort of not knowing. I made that decision. I would make it again without hesitation. Do not wait until your daughter is sitting on your porch with mascara on her cheeks to ask the questions you should have asked years earlier. That is my one regret. Ask sooner. Look closer. Trust what you feel before you can prove it. These family drama revenge stories are not simply about betrayal. They are about what a person does when the people they trusted most turn out to be strangers. Every family story's revenge begins with someone staying quiet too long. Do not be that person. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. I want to hear from you. Share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. These family stories, revenge stories, include fictional elements crafted for reflection. If this content is not for you, we respect that completely. Find what speaks to your heart. No judgment, only gratitude.